Yo, what's going on, boys? Baka here from Meta World Gaming, coming at you with a nice HEIMERDINGER deck profile. I hit top 10 on NA Masters with this deck. Gonna be going breaking down the mulligans and the general strategy here with this deck, how to be playing it, and just any tips that I can really give you guys on how to play Vi Heimer here. I think this deck is insane. Probably, I don't know if it's the best deck, but easily top 3. No doubt in my mind. I think it's like only really bad matchup is Noxus Piltover for the most part. Against every other deck, you seem to have a really good strategy to just combat pretty much everything that's going on right now. Couple flex spots. You can actually change the deck a little bit depending on what we're playing against, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But let's get into it. I mean, the list is here, and I'm gonna have it linked down below in the description, as well as all of my Mobalytics decks, as well as the rest of the team's Mobalytics decks. So be sure to check everything out, and you can just copy paste right from the info section down there. All right. So of course our all stars here, Heimerdinger and Vi. There's for obvious reasons we're playing 3 Heimer. 3 Vi though, I see a lot of people playing it, and I go back and forth on it. I think a lot of the times you really only need 2 copies in the deck. It kind of depends on what you're seeing on ladder and if you want to find space for other stuff. I don't think that Vi is actually very good against your worst matchup, but it's just a very well-rounded card that also is pretty decent in your opening hand. We are playing for our followers 3 Claws of the Dragon, 3 Shadow Assassin, and 3 Solitary Monk. Pretty low on followers, as Heimer pretty much just wins the game through all of Heimer's turrets as your followers, and you try to play as many spells as you can. Moving on to these spells, though. 3 Thermogenic Beam, 3 Mystic Shot, 3 Get Excited, 3 Flash, 3 Twin Disciplines, only 2 Deny. It's a little clunky sometimes, and you don't need 3. It's really only good against or 3 copies is only good against like Karina Control, maybe Sea Monsters, but Sea Monsters is pretty much a free win for you. In Karina Control, you have like enough going on there. That's the only deck that makes me think that I would ever want 3 denies in this. Pretty much everything else you don't need it. It's not very crucial. 2 Spirits Refuge, pretty much same thing as deny. I mean, this card is very essential to have as a way to gain life and another way to protect our Heimerdinger, but it can be very clunky, so we don't play 3 copies of this card. 3 Will of Ionia, and 3 Deep Meditation. I've seen some lists only play 2 Will of Ionia. Don't really understand it. You definitely need 3 of this card, especially now with all those unyielding spirit decks going around. It's kind of just a catch-all for a lot of strategies, so I would never run less than 3 cards. I think our only flex slots in this whole list are our 3rd Vi and the Claws of the Dragon. Pretty much everything else I would keep like 100%. I would never really want to change. I think I've tried a lot of things here in this Claws of the Dragon slot. I've tried the Veteran Investigator as a good way to draw. I've tried Chempunk as well as Eye of the Dragon. And brief thing about this slot in general is that it needs to be a 2-mana 3/2. If it's not Claws of the Dragon, it needs to be some other 2-mana card. Eye of the Dragon is the only not 3/2. But Eye of the Dragon does a lot against your aggressive matchups in the form of gaining the lifesteal as well as just being a 1/3 body for 2 mana. But for the most part, you want this to just be able to trade with anything on turn 2, especially any fearsome cards such as Elise. Those are very important ones to be able to block or just contest it all on turn 2. There's a lot of 2/3s though. And just having any early game cards, like you just use this card like a removal spell. You just play it on turn 2 and you trade. Sometimes they don't have anything and you do get extra bits of damage, and that's very important, but you should always be aiming to just trade. Claws the Dragon obviously has potential to be a 0 mana 3/2, but for the sake of needing something early on, it can also do that. It can also just be a 2 mana 3/2 and just trade. It obviously, in that situation where you play it, it is essentially strictly worse than a Chempunk or a Veteran Investigator. Not always Eyes of the Dragon, but the other 2. So I wanted to try them out because a lot of times I found myself just playing Claws as a 2-mana 3/2, and there isn't a ton of scenarios where I wanted to be jamming this card for its free effect. But that nice bonus has come up sometimes where it does save you the game. The main difference between that is that a lot of the times it does nothing, but when it does, that's a way that you can win a potentially unwinnable game. So you're kind of hedging your bet to help your worst matchup, but I think a lot of the other matchups where you're already feeling all right, or in games where you could easily already be winning the game, this card is actually just strictly worse than all of our alternatives for the most part. I don't feel like a lot of times too, like you fill up your board and then this card comes in play for free, and I literally just kill it to put turrets in its place. But those games are like games where you're in a winning position. So we're trying to play this card to just make it not. We're just trying to improve our shit matchups. Basically, we want our Noxus Piltover matchup to just be a little bit better at the cost of in our like good matchups and games that we're probably winning being a little bit worse, a little bit harder to win by having that trade off. But I've been digging it for a while. I could see at some point maybe I cut it. It kind of depends where the meta goes. If we start seeing a lot of decks go away, or a lot of people playing things other than Noxus Piltover, other than the Demacia decks, where we don't care to just have cheap bodies, right? Like this is literally just a blocker on a stick, right? Like it blocks an attack, maybe it gets a trade in, sure. Does nothing else. That's all you want it to do. A lot of the times you will find yourself blocking anything, regardless of whether this trades or not, when you get it in play for 0. You'll take any block that you can against Demacia. You'll take any block that you can against Noxus Piltover just to save yourself life. So, that being said, if we see a lot less of those decks, I would probably opt to take this card out and then put in either Veteran Investigator or Chempunk. Probably the Investigator, because I think the card draw is really, really important for us and much less important for our opponents. But Veteran Investigator is pretty bad against the Noxus Piltover deck of just giving them an extra card. But I think against a lot of the slower decks, the extra card for your opponent doesn't actually matter as much as a lot of people think it does. We have a lot of combo pieces in our deck, so digging one deeper off of that draw is pretty relevant. That being said, the general game plan for this deck is to combo your opponent's death with Heimerdinger. Now, there are certain matchups where you can start just taking trades with all of the turrets off of Heimerdinger and try to go for like an infinite value game on your opponent. But what I think a lot of people miss the point of playing Heimer when that's I think a lot of people's go-to strategy of playing this deck, and you should be trying to play this deck as an elusive deck. You're almost always trying to take any early chip damage that you can. You're going to be aggressively mulling for Heimerdinger and Solitary Monk as your main cards, and if you're playing against any aggressive deck, you want to find any of these 3 pieces of removal. But taking any early chip damage that you can goes a long ways, and you're going to try to combo and deal usually about 12 damage to your opponent to finish the game with Heimerdinger. Heimerdinger comboed with a Flash of Brilliance and like a Get Excited is 9 damage and just a very simple 2-card combination. If you have more Flash of Brilliance, it's even better. Twin Disciplines, even more. There's so many ways to just pile on damage. And you need to keep Heimerdinger in your opening hand to do this, though. As well as going for the long, drawn-out value games. Like, no matter what, like your deck is a Heimerdinger deck. And although a lot of people think, like, oh, we have to make it to turn 5, so, like, against our aggressive matchups, maybe we don't want to keep this and we want to find ways to answer our opponent's cards. No. Because if you answer all of their cards and then you don't have Heimerdinger, you are just delaying your death. You're not coming back. You're trying to postpone your death until you can get to a Heimerdinger and stabilize, get to something like Vi even and stabilize. But without the stabilization tool in the form of your champions, you'll never get there. The deck does not stabilize without these. So all these cards are ways to get you to this setup and then use either of these to kind of just take control of the board and come back. Vi can do it for a little while, but she won't win a game on her own. She can do a lot of work, though. Heimerdinger obviously wins the game on his own when he comes in, as long as you have enough spells to back him up. I don't generally keep Vi in my opening hand versus the hyper-aggressive matchups, but against pretty much everything else, I think Vi is a reasonable keep. Like against Noxus Piltover, you can't be keeping Vi. It's too slow. You need to be finding these removal cards. Against Demacia, though, this card becomes a far more reasonable keep as they don't have as much burn. So once you can put a huge threat onto the board, you can kind of stabilize off of Vi alone against that deck. Great answer to Grizzled Ranger, getting both of those cards off the board. And often, if you just one spell and she won't even die from that turn, which is huge. That's like a big part of that. game revolves around that turn 4, turn 5 for Demacia when they start to pop off. Really good answer to Quinn. She can block Quinn or get challenged and then block it. Like, she's 2 blocks on a lot of their turns where they're attacking twice, is kind of what I'm getting at. And also, you can challenge cards off their board if you have the attack on 5, and then possibly get a block or 2 out of her on the following turn. That is already good enough, and if you can combo that with something like Twin Disciplines or a Spirit's Refuge, you can pretty much just end the game off of Vi Tempo alone before we even get to the Heimerdinger, or it buys us a lot of turns to get to our Heimerdinger. The general strat, though, for Mulligan against any deck is just look for Solitary Monk, look for Heimerdinger, and Thermogenic Beam. Thermogenic Beam is good against every deck, whereas Mystic Shot is only good against specific cards against the decks that it's good against, whereas Thermogenic Beam is just good against every possible unit that they can play between turn 1 and turn 3. It gives you answers to cards that these do not give you answers to, such as the the Badger Bear from that name. I wanted to call it Grizzled Bear. Badger Bear in Demacia is the only way that you're going to be dealing 4 damage to that with a spell. The alternative is getting Solitary Monk. So these two give you the best trading tools that you can get against the widest variety of cards. Mystic Shot is pretty much only answering turn or 1 cost units, but you don't get to play it until turn 2. So sometimes you can keep a Mystic Shot. If you have some of the other pieces that we're looking for, such as Heimer, Monk, or Thermo, I wouldn't mind keeping a Mystic Shot against more aggressive decks, but those 3 are the most important. Claws of the Dragon is also almost always better than having a Mystic Shot, because this card can deal 3 damage and actually deal with turn 2 cards. I pretty much never keep Get Excited. I don't think this card is worth keeping, even if you're playing against something that has very scary turn 3s and turn 8s or turn 2s. That's just, this is the worst form of removal, and you can run out of cards too quickly. And I see a lot of people doing this against the aggressive matchups. They keep their Get Exciteds, and it's like, this is the worst case scenario. We'd rather just throw this and get maximum odds at drawing a Claws of the Dragon, Thermo, or Heimer, like any of these other cards. And then if we happen to miss on drawing all of these cards in our mulligan and we get kind of screwed, we might just end up getting left with the Get Excited as another potential draw, as like our last resort. We don't want to be keeping this and aiming to use this, though. This is just the, like, well, I literally have nothing else to do. I have to answer guys. I guess I'll play Get Excited. But pretty much, I want every other early card that I can possibly get over that. I want Thermo, Mystic, Claws, Shadow Assassin, Monk, and Heimerdinger. You need to have at least 1. I'd rather have all these cards in my hand against aggro than get a Get Excited. That is a total of 18 cards that we can be looking for with our mulligan. So it's pretty likely that if you were just chucking everything in your hand because you missed all of these, that we don't need to keep a Get Excited, so that we can just, you know, we land on one of our 18. That's almost half our deck. We have really good odds of hitting the cards that we actually want to see. And if we somehow get unlucky enough to not hit any of those, then we extend into a Get Excited as another potential draw. And now that's 21 cards in our deck. That being said, also about the Get Excited, never use it if you have any other alternative form of removal against any deck, because this is burn. And a lot of people I see doing this with Heimer is they use their burn a little too aggressively early on. Mystic Shot is okay to use when it gets the trade, but like Get Excited is very important to finish games. This hits their face for 3 and then generates a 3-mana turret, which is our most important turret, our elusive 3/1. So this is 3 damage to the face there, another 3 damage with the elusive card, 6 damage on a card. Like, this is how you win the game a lot of the time. Either you hit them with a full board and you burn them with Get Excited, or you burn them with the Get Excited and then summon the elusive guy. This is generally the last card that you only want to use this, though, when you know you're going to win. I wouldn't try to use this like too preemptively unless it's setting up for a lethal and it's not too risky. Our general things that we want to be doing with our Heimerdinger or our mulligans, or sorry, not for our mulligans, but once we've actually gotten to turn 5, what you're trying to set up is often a curve that looks something like a Thermo or a Mystic Shot in your first 2 turns, maybe a Claws of the Dragon. These 3 are go-to for turn 1 and 2. Ideally, we want Thermo or Claws, backup plan Mystic Shot. Or if we already have one of these, we'd be okay with keeping one of these if we already have Heimerdinger. You really need to hit Heimerdinger, though. If you don't have Heimerdinger, you pretty much throw everything that is not Solitary Monk or Thermogenic Beam. And if you're playing against a Noxus Piltover deck or a Demacia deck, you can keep Claws. I wouldn't keep Shadow Assassin if I don't have Heimerdinger. And I wouldn't keep Shadow Assassin, even if I do have Heimerdinger, if I don't have either of these 3 cards, the most important ones, Monk, Claws, Thermo. But our curve can look like a Monk on 3 is our desirable play on turn 3. Turn 4, you often pass, and never feel bad about passing in this deck, because banking 3 mana for turn 5 is extremely important. That's another thing that I see a lot of people mess up on, is they wait a little too long to get their Heimer out, when they could have had it out earlier if they had just set up their mana properly. You want to play Heimer on 5 with 3 mana banked, have, of course, as many Flash Brilliance as you can, and a Twin Disciplines to back it up. If you don't have a backup to protect your Heimer from a removal spell that almost every deck has some way that they can interact with Heimer, don't play him. It's another thing that people do is then they spend their mana and they either wait too long to get the Heimer, because they could have had it set up already where it was guaranteed to resolve, or they try to run it out on 5 with no backup mana and just hope that it lives, and that is just throwing the game unless you have multiple Heimerdingers in your hand. That's the only time that I think that play is ever warranted in any way. And against some decks, you might have to opt to play your Heimerdinger on turn 6 with 4 spell mana banked so that you can protect it with a Deny or a Spirit's Refuge if you know that your opponent's out is going to play around a Heimer with 6 HP. Good examples of that are Vengeance in the Karina deck, or any deck that, like Nautilus Sea Monsters. Like, you need Deny. The Twin Disciplines will not save you if they have enough mana to play a Vengeance. It's never safe to be running that out, and Heimerdinger, you can't just be throwing that away against those decks. Usually they're not too hard of a matchup, but you need the Heimer to win. If you have Vi on 5 instead, obviously great. You might be able to bait the Vengeance out even, or other things, and then you can follow up with the Heimer with your 4 mana on the following turn. If you do know, though, that against, say, those decks that they're tapped out to a point where there is no combination of cards that Heimer plus Twin Disciplines gets beat by, you can develop your Heimer there. And you don't just jam the Twin Disciplines either. If you're trying to just develop elusive guys that turn, you just need Heimer to resolve and stick on the board, and then untap your mana crystals. That is the goal of this deck. If you happen to have Flash of Brilliance, you always play them. There's just pretty much no reason not to be playing them when you play your Heimer. But you don't need to just aggressively go and play a Twin Disciplines and play a Get Excited because you want to immediately get value out of your Heimer if that mana is the only thing that's going to keep your Heimer alive. You need to make sure that this guy lives. So if you're, let's say, for example, you're playing against a Shadow Isles deck, you know that they can have Grasp for 5 mana, and they only have 5 mana. They don't have enough mana to play Vengeance. And you do also have a Deny in your hand for the following turn, or enough spells that you think that if they Vengeanced it, you could just dump your hand to form lethal after they tap out and play Vengeance. One of those two has to be the case. If you're playing it because they only have 5 mana and they have Grasp, right, and you have Twin Disciplines for your turn, you only have 3 mana yourself, you could play it, but you have to think about the following turn and just make sure, okay, am I able to protect it there with a Deny? Am I able to protect it there by killing my opponent if they tap out for a Vengeance? Or is, if I have neither of those, probably not worth developing at that point? You gotta think Ruination 2. I mean, the alternatives are you could Will of Ionia your own card back to your hand, but you can't just run it out and have it die on the following turn is the alternative scenario. The only deck that really is scary against those decks that play Vengeance or Ruination. Against pretty much every other deck, though, if you can protect it through the first turn, you should almost always be able to protect it through the following turns with all that mana up, because they don't play cards like Vengeance, they just play damage cards. So it's pretty simple to just protect it at that point. We have a lot of ways to do that between our Twin Disciplines, Spirit Refuge, and Deny. Deep Meditation also fishes for a lot of these cards. But yeah, that's our general game plan. Set up for Heimer, 3 spell mana, have a Twin Disciplines to protect him. If your opponent plays easy ways to just deal or kill it through 6 HP, then we have to wait, and we'll often go for the 4 spell mana Heimerdinger play and use a Deny or a Spirit's Refuge. So where Spirit's Refuge, though, can come in play that Twin Disciplines doesn't is the common case is Single Combat is one of the really common ones when you're playing against Demacia. Twin Disciplines doesn't always work if your opponent just has a card with 6 attack. So that is not always incredibly easy on turn 5, but it is certainly possible. They could have just had a card that was buffed. That's all it takes, right? And if you're playing this card on turn 6 now, instead of turn 5, they could have Cythria, and then Cythria plus single combat will get the job done. But on turn 6, you can set up to have 4 spell mana, and then be able to deny that, or play Spirit's Refuge instead. And that will protect you. Also have to be wary of challengers, though, because if they have the challenger afterwards, then, he's going to die there. But, you got to just set it up and think about your opponent's outs and make sure that you always have a way to respond. You can always use Will of Ionia, too, if you're trying, like I said, playing against those slower decks that are going to commit a lot of mana to kill the Heimer, and you respond Will and bounce back to your hand. Or you can run out your first one because you have a second one in hand and just bait out the responses and go through that way. Generally, though, once your Heimer has stuck, you're just aiming to identify the position that you are in the game. You are either trying to play as many elusive guys as you can, without, of course, playing too heavily into cards like Withering Wail. If you didn't have a response, like having a deny up for that, it's very important. Like being able to protect your guys once they come out. You gotta think ahead so you don't kind of just vomit your hand and go for it. Or if you know your opponent has no responses, vomit your hand and go for it. And if the elusive route is not going to work, we're not going to be able to just burst and kill our opponent. The alternative position that you're in is that you're going for an ultimate like value trade, right? If our opponent has a lot of interaction in their deck, it's a little too risky to try to gamble a big elusive play, and then you start playing the game a little slower, and you just start taking as much value as you can out of your Heimer until you find your opening to win the game. Once you've kind of dwindled them down on their resources quite a bit, like they can only have so many cards, like Withering Wail, like Static Shock, things like that. As long as you feel like you have the time and you're not being pressured by cards, like Ladros into, whatever, and like your life is just going to be dead, or you're going to be dead very soon. Or if you're playing against like Ezreal and you know that the lethal is imminent, you have to kind of play to your outs there and be like, okay, we're going to have to put the pressure on. We can't try and play this value game here. But in other matchups, you might find yourself just like, okay, I can just take my time here and take the trades. But I think the common case is setting up, thinking about your turn clock that you can create to kill your opponent with the elusive cards. So getting in any chip damage that we can early on with Solitary Monk on 3 is huge. Like your opponent being at 16 is killable in one turn. Your opponent being at 20 is very hard to kill in one turn. Your opponent being at 12, very easy to kill in one turn. 16 is doable. 20 is almost always impossible unless your opponent is literally just doesn't have any cards or anything to play. 12, though, very easy for Heimer to do. Especially because an easy multiple of 3. All of your elusives are 3s. Your Twin Disciplines add 3 extra damage. Your Get Exciteds do 3 extra damage. Also need to keep in mind, the multiples of 3 is kind of the number of sources of damage you're going to need to kill your opponent. So in the case of 12, it is only 4 sources of damage. It's very easy to actually find a way to get that through in one turn and kill your opponent. If you are being pressured by your opponent in the early game and you do have a Solitary Monk, it's always good to consider that our deck probably has more burst than our opponent's, unless our opponent is playing Noxus Piltover or a more aggressive, like less mid-rangey version of Demacia. There's quite a few versions running around, but if they start a very aggressive start, you can take a trade on a Badger Bear with a Solitary Monk to protect yourself. But a lot of times there will be cases where your opponent attacks and we don't block with our Solitary Monk. We don't even need to take value trades with our Solitary Monk against like spiders, because then our Solitary Monk becomes easier to kill. For instance, if our opponent plays Brood Awakening and we're going to take blocks on 2/1s to get a value trade, now our Solitary Monk is potentially dying to a Static Shock or a Vile Feast or a Withering Wail, whereas before the only ways that they were killing it was Get Excited, Thermogenic Beam, or like a Gotcha or a Grass, like things that all cost a lot of mana outside of like them top decking a Gotcha. But your damage just matters a lot more than their damage does in almost every situation. So just be very mindful of that, like I said, hitting just once or twice with your Solitary Monk can set up for a one-turn kill with your Heimerdinger. Whereas if you were taking trades through the game with things like Shadow Assassin, Monk, and you're not actually getting your damage in with these, it can become very hard to kill them in one turn, which in some cases is okay. Like I said, against your Noxus Piltover matchup, you have to block everything. Every possible block that you can do, you need to take. Every point of life could be just a full additional turn that you have to stabilize, pop off on a Spirit's Refuge or pop off on a Heimerdinger and kill them, or run them out of cards. So you pretty much take every block that you possibly can against that deck. Especially with your Solitary Monk, this can trade with just about everything. If they're playing Draven, ideally you don't want to be blocking that, but that's about it. Pretty much every other card you're kind of cool with just taking a trade on to conserve life. Even if it's like, it seems like the shittiest trade, like blocking a Legion Grenadier with Solitary Monk, just the 3/1 with Last Breath deal 2. Like, wow, that's the worst trade ever with a Monk. Is like, that's 3 damage you didn't take. So that matters a lot more than you hitting your opponent for 4 in that matchup specifically. And again, against Demacia, blocking the 4/4 on turn 3 can be the same thing, or getting a value block in somewhere along the line if your opponent's curve is just a little too aggressive. Say they hadn't done anything until turn 3, and then they just play Badger Bear on turn 3, and you have a Solitary Monk, I would heavily consider just letting that go through, depending on what the rest of my hand looks like, so that I can use my Solitary Monk and get some chip damage in, and then I'll just trade later after she's put in some work, because we can set up for an OTK a little bit easier than that deck can. That being said, though, you can look at the rest of your hand, and if it doesn't seem like you have a lot of protection, you're not going to have a lot of, like, you might need to save your life because you just need to take the trade there, or it doesn't look like you're going to be able to actually benefit from racing your opponent because you don't have Heimerdinger, you don't have those spells, like, you just kind of bricked your hand. You probably need to take that trade with Solitary Monk to buy yourself as much time as possible, even in a position where normally you'd be cool with taking damage there. Vi is definitely your stabilizer, though, against Demacia, any kind of mid-rangey deck. Like, a lot of times you're aiming to play your Vi before the Heimer to buy you a lot of time, unless you know that the Heimer is guaranteed going to stick. But like, you could take a Solitary Monk trade on 3 against Demacia, depending on how aggressive their curve's looking, and then if you kept your Vi in your opener, which I think is definitely good against Demacia, I wouldn't do it against Noxus Piltover, but against pretty much any other deck, I'd be down to keep this in my opening hand. You can pretty easily stabilize off the Vi, and then it puts enough pressure onto your opponent that they start spending mana to deal with this, or they're trying to rebuild their board faster so that they can keep up their aggression, and then that actually opens you up to play your Heimer, which was previously not playable, because your opponent was just going to have too much mana or too many outs. And you can let them sink a lot of resources into trying to dealing with this, and if you can set up for a big Vi because you kept it early on, plus a Spirit's Refuge against any of those decks, it's almost immediately game over. Like, against the Demacia deck, because they're not quite as aggressive as the Noxus Piltover and they don't have as much burn, you get a little more time to set up for something like this. You could single-handedly end the game with a Vi and Spirit's Refuge, or sometimes Vi alone. Sometimes Vi alone is just too much value for that deck. It's too big of a body, too much blocking power, the challenging power, just get way too many guys off their board if they haven't been able to, like, curve 1, 2, 3, 4 on you up to that point, and you weren't able to deal with it. That's, like, usually the scenario where she's not doing a whole lot. Against Demacia, though, also, something to note is you can identify when your opponent is playing a lower interaction deck versus a higher interaction deck. If your opponent is playing a lower interaction deck, for example, Demacia, especially one that's not playing Ionia, I've seen a lot of the Ionia lists going around, you should know that your OTK with Heimer that turn is almost always going to work. There's very little your opponent can do in response. The only thing that they can really do is play a single combat, or potentially play a Relentless Pursuit to try to, like, swing for lethal and force you into using some of your attackers as blockers. So, that being said, about what I said about the Solitary Monk earlier, it is generally more valuable against a deck like that to be taking the hits, and why we would ignore a Badger Bear on turn 3 to set ourselves up for the easiest OTK that we can get with our Heimerdinger. But you do have to identify, like I said, sometimes their curve is just too aggressive. There's nothing that you can really do about it, so you have to just take the trades where you can. It's the only way that you're going to stay in the game so that you can get to this point. That's if they curve 1, 2 Badger Bear, you had no response to the 1, no response to the 2, and this is all you're really looking like you got for the foreseeable future. So I think it's not something that can easily be seen if you first start playing this deck, but I think over time you'll start to pick up the clock that your opponent is representing and the clock that you can represent by hitting with your Solitary Monk and figuring out where you can trade and where you can't. Again, with the low interaction of that deck, value trades are significantly better with Solitary Monk when you're playing against a deck like that. So Solitary Monk can block a War Chef's because there's almost nothing your opponent can do. unless they obviously have the riposte mana open, which a lot of decks aren't even playing, or you think that like they have that and then they're immediately going to play a challenger or something before you like you get your next opportunity to swing really or effectively. They might have a single combat on another guy. Like there's a few things they can do, but not that much. So it feels a lot better blocking against those decks than other decks. If you're playing against something like Karina though, and you're blocking spiders, like I said before, a million ways that deck deals damage. Never want to do it. Don't even give them the opportunity to kill this card easily. Make it as hard as it can be, because this is one of your best ways to deal damage in your deck to set up for your OTK turn. Yeah, I mean that's the gist of it. I would say it's the moles are Heimerdinger, Solitary Monk, Thermogenic Beam is what you want against every deck. More aggressive decks, we want Claws of the Dragon, and Shadow Assassin is okay to keep once we've kind of had all of these other things line up. It's like a decent concession. Mystic Shot as well. Again, if we have some of these other pieces. I would also keep Vi, just not against every matchup. Like I said, Noxus Piltover, we're not going to keep that. Pretty much everything else, though, I think she's good to keep. I don't really see a problem with that. She gets huge by the time she comes out, so I'm down with it. Potential changes to the deck. You see a lot of Noxus Piltover. I would cut one Vi and probably the third copy of Deep Meditation and run 2 health potions. If you're just playing against way too much Noxus Piltover, that card will often buy you 1 turn, and the 1 turn usually makes a world of difference. If you can just barely have more life than they have, enough burn damage to deal. For now, I'm going to stick with Claws of the Dragon, but we'll see in the future if there's actually any room for change. I don't think Eye of the Dragon triggers enough for you to want to play it. Maybe if you were playing the health potions, then you could play Eyes of the Dragon, but I still think Claws of the Dragon is probably the way to go. But yeah, check us out for sure. The link to the Twitch channel will be linked down below. We're going to be playing a lot of this deck in the near future. I think this is going to be probably the most played deck last format for us. Heimerdinger Karma. It's kind of the Meta World Gaming special. We had every player was very proficient in that deck. We all did very well in Master with it. And then we have 3 players that hit Master this season already, with all using this deck, give or take like a card or 2. 2 of us made top 10, 1 on EU, I'm on NA, and then we had another in Master, and I think he's like rank 40 right now or something. It'll be different whenever this video comes out, but you guys get that. If you want to ask any specific questions, I mean, feel free to drop a comment or even like come on the stream. We're always down to just talk about any of this. You join the Discord as well. We answer questions pretty much anywhere you can ask them. We'll answer them. Don't you worry, guys. So I hope this is helpful for everybody. Thanks. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, follow on Twitter, Facebook, Discord. We have contests going on, tournaments for our subs. Like, there's all kinds of cool stuff in the Discord. So sure to come through. All right, later, guys.